I'm Dr. Amara Hassan, 34, standing in the corner of my cousin Layla's wedding reception in Damascus, watching my extended family celebrate while avoiding eye contact with me, the daughter who chose selfishness over family honor. They have no idea that the woman they've spent 12 years calling the lost one has just returned from performing emergency surgery in a refugee camp where I saved the lives of 37 children in conditions they couldn't imagine. Tonight, when a UN humanitarian coordinator recognizes me and announces my work to the entire wedding party, everything my family believes about duty, honor, and service is about to change forever. Before I tell you how one moment of recognition shattered years of silence, let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit that subscribe button, because this story proves that sometimes the greatest honor comes from the paths others call disgraceful. Growing up as Amara Hassan in a traditional Syrian family meant understanding your place in an intricate web of expectations that stretched back generations. My father, Dr. Omar Hassan, was a respected pediatrician who ran a private clinic in one of Damascus's affluent neighborhoods. My mother, Fatima, came from a prominent merchant family and had dedicated her life to raising children and maintaining the social connections that defined our family's status in the community. In our household, success for women was measured by different standards than success for men. My three brothers, Khalil, Samir, and Yazin, were expected to excel academically, pursue prestigious careers, and eventually provide financially for their families. As the only daughter, I was expected to excel academically as well, but ultimately to marry well, raise children who would honor our family name, and maintain the traditions that had sustained our culture for centuries. This wasn't oppression in the way that Western narratives often portray Middle Eastern families. It was a deeply rooted belief system that valued family cohesion, cultural continuity, and the understanding that individual desires should serve the greater good of the family unit. My parents weren't cruel or controlling. They were loving people who wanted me to find happiness within a framework they understood and trusted. But from my earliest memories, I was drawn to my father's medical practice in ways that extended beyond curiosity. When he would return home from the clinic and discuss difficult cases over dinner, I found myself asking detailed questions about diagnoses, treatment options, and patient outcomes. When my brothers would grow bored with these conversations and excuse themselves from the table, I would stay and listen, absorbing information about medical procedures and patient care with an intensity that puzzled my parents. By the time I was 12, I was spending after-school hours at my father's clinic, initially helping with filing and basic administrative tasks, but gradually taking on more responsibility as my understanding of medical practice grew. I learned to take patient histories, assist with basic procedures, and manage the complex scheduling that kept the clinic running efficiently. My father was proud of my interest and intelligence, but he was also concerned about the intensity of my focus on medicine. Amara, he would say gently, it's wonderful that you understand and appreciate medical work, but remember that a woman's greatest contribution is raising the next generation. You can use your knowledge to care for your own children and to be a better wife to a husband who will appreciate your intelligence. These conversations never felt restrictive because they came from love and genuine concern for my future happiness. In my father's worldview, marriage and motherhood weren't limitations, they were the highest calling for women, the roles that would bring me the greatest fulfillment and social respect. But as I grew older, my attraction to medicine intensified rather than diminished. During my teenage years, I would spend hours reading medical textbooks, studying anatomy diagrams, and following medical journals that my father subscribed to. I was particularly drawn to trauma surgery and emergency medicine, the high-stakes, life-or-death situations where split-second decisions and technical skill meant the difference between losing and saving a life. The turning point came during my final year of secondary school, when my examination scores qualified me for admission to Damascus University's medical program. It was an achievement that should have been celebrated. Medical school admission was highly competitive, and my scores were among the highest in the country that year. Instead, the achievement created the first serious conflict in our family. My parents had expected me to pursue a degree in education or literature, something that would make me a more cultured and intelligent wife, but wouldn't create career expectations that might conflict with family responsibilities. Amara, my mother said when the acceptance letter arrived, we're very proud of your intelligence, but medical school is a 6-year commitment that will take you away from finding a suitable husband during the most important years of your life. What happens when you're 30 and still unmarried because you've been studying instead of building the relationships that lead to marriage? My father was more direct. Habibti, being a doctor's wife is very different from being a doctor yourself. As a doctor's wife, you can use your medical knowledge to support your husband's career and to care for your family. As a doctor yourself, you'll be competing with men for positions that will require you to work long hours and deal with situations that aren't appropriate for a woman. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of my young life. I tried to explain that I felt called to medicine in a way that went beyond intellectual interest, that I believed I could save lives and serve God through healing in ways that seemed as important as serving through motherhood. I argued that medicine was a form of service that honored Islamic values of caring for others and using one's talents for the greater good. My parents listened with patience and love, but they remained unconvinced. In their understanding, individual calling had to be balanced against family responsibility and social expectations. They worried that pursuing medicine would make me unmarriageable, that I would spend my fertile years in medical school and residency training, and that I would ultimately find myself alone and regretful in my 30s. The compromise we reached felt reasonable at the time. I would defer medical school admission for 1 year while we explored marriage possibilities with families who might appreciate a highly educated wife. If I found a suitable husband who supported my interest in medicine, I could pursue medical school with my family's blessing. If not, I would accept that God had a different path for me and would find fulfillment in other forms of service. But the year of marriage exploration was a disaster that confirmed my worst fears about the incompatibility between my aspirations and traditional expectations. The families who expressed interest in marriage were indeed impressed by my intelligence and education, but they viewed these qualities as assets that would benefit their sons rather than as the foundation for my own career. The conversations were always polite and respectful, but the underlying assumptions were clear. I would be expected to use my medical knowledge to support my husband's career if he was also a doctor, or to manage the health concerns of extended family members if he was in a different profession. The possibility that I might want to practice medicine independently, particularly in demanding specialties like trauma surgery, was never seriously considered. After meeting with 7 different families over the course of 8 months, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I told my parents that I was going to pursue medical school, with or without their blessing, and that I would find a way to honor both my professional calling and my family responsibilities. The conversation took place on a Thursday evening in March, with the scent of jasmine drifting through our garden windows and the call to Maghrib prayer echoing from the nearby mosque. I had rehearsed what I would say for weeks, but facing my parents' disappointed expressions made the words more difficult than I had anticipated. Baba, Mama, I began, using the childhood terms that had always softened difficult conversations. I understand your concerns about my future, and I respect the wisdom that comes from your love for me. But I believe that God has given me a gift for healing that I'm meant to use in service to others. I can't ignore that calling, even if it means taking a path that's different from what you had hoped for me. My father's response was measured but firm. Amara, we have never questioned your intelligence or your intentions. But you're asking us to support a decision that goes against everything we believe about what will make you happy and fulfilled. We've seen too many women who chose careers over family and lived to regret it. And we've seen too many men who struggle with wives who are more focused on their careers than on their homes, my mother added. You're asking us to support a choice that will make it very difficult for you to find a husband who will appreciate and accept your priorities. The conversation continued for hours, with both sides expressing love and concern while remaining fundamentally convinced of their own position. Finally, as the call to Isha prayer filled the evening air, my father made a statement that would haunt our relationship for years to come. Amara, if you choose this path, you choose it alone. We cannot support a decision that we believe will ultimately bring you unhappiness and isolation. We will always love you, but we cannot pretend to approve of choices that go against our deepest convictions about what is best for you. I enrolled in medical school the following September, moving into a small apartment near the university and beginning a phase of my life that was simultaneously the most challenging and the most fulfilling I had ever experienced. The academic demands were enormous, but they felt natural rather than burdensome. The long hours of study, the complex memorization requirements, the detailed understanding of human physiology, all of it came together in ways that confirmed my belief that I was pursuing the right path. But the social isolation was more difficult than I had anticipated. My parents had kept their word about continuing to love me, but their disapproval created a distance that affected every family interaction. When I would visit home for Friday family dinners, conversations would be polite but strained, with obvious efforts to avoid discussing my studies or my future plans. Extended family members were even more critical. Aunts and uncles who had once praised my intelligence now spoke about me in whispers, using phrases like the stubborn one and the daughter who thinks she knows better than her parents. Cousins who had been close friends during our childhood began treating me with a mixture of curiosity and pity, unable to understand why I would choose such a difficult path when easier options were available. The most painful aspect was the gradual realization that my family had begun discussing me as a cautionary tale. Younger female cousins were warned about the dangers of becoming too educated or too independent, with my example used to illustrate how academic success could lead to social isolation and family conflict. But medical school also brought relationships and experiences that sustained me through the family difficulties. I formed close friendships with other students who understood the demands of medical training and the sacrifices required to excel in the field. I found mentors among the faculty who recognized my aptitude for surgery and encouraged me to pursue the most challenging specializations. Most importantly, I began working in the university hospital's emergency department during my clinical rotations, where I experienced the profound satisfaction of using my skills to save lives and ease suffering. The first time I assisted in a trauma surgery, watching a skilled surgeon repair damage that would have been fatal without intervention, I knew with absolute certainty that I had chosen the right path. The patient was a construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding, sustaining internal injuries that required immediate surgical intervention. I assisted the attending surgeon for 6 hours, maintaining focus and precision while we repaired organ damage and controlled bleeding that could have resulted in death within minutes. When the patient was finally stable and transferred to recovery, the attending surgeon, Dr. Mahmoud Khouri, looked at me with an expression I had never seen from a faculty member before, genuine respect and recognition. "Miss Hassan," he said, "you have steady hands and an intuitive understanding of surgical anatomy that can't be taught. If you're serious about pursuing surgery, I think you have the potential to become exceptional in this field." That conversation took place at 3 a.m, after the longest and most intense day of my medical school experience. I was exhausted, covered in surgical scrubs that had been stained with blood, and more fulfilled than I had ever been in my life. I called my mother when I got home, wanting to share the excitement and validation of the experience. "Mama," I said, "I just helped save a man's life. Dr. Khouri said I have real surgical talent, and he wants to recommend me for advanced training." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I wondered if the connection had been lost. "Amara," she finally said, her voice tired and sad, "I'm sure you did good work, and I'm sure the doctor was impressed. But at the end of the day, you're still alone in an apartment, calling your mother instead of sharing your achievements with a husband who would be proud of you. Success without family is just elaborate loneliness." The conversation ended with both of us frustrated and hurt, me because she couldn't appreciate the significance of what I was accomplishing, and her because I couldn't see the social and personal costs of the path I was pursuing. This dynamic continued throughout medical school and into my residency training. I would experience professional triumphs, outstanding evaluations, research opportunities, recognition from attendings who saw my potential, but these achievements existed in isolation from my family relationships. My brothers, meanwhile, were following more traditional paths that earned family approval and celebration. Khalil graduated from engineering school and married the daughter of a family friend, a wedding that was celebrated for weeks and attended by hundreds of guests. Samir completed his business degree and joined our uncle's import company, quickly establishing himself as a successful young executive. Yazan pursued law and was accepted into a prestigious firm in Damascus. Each of their milestones was marked with family gatherings, congratulations, and obvious pride from my parents. My achievements, graduating near the top of my medical school class, matching into a competitive surgery residency, receiving research awards, were acknowledged politely but never celebrated. The contrast became stark during my residency years, when the demands of surgical training required me to work 80-hour weeks and often miss family events entirely. When I would apologize for being unable to attend cousin weddings or family celebrations, the response was always understanding but tinged with disapproval. "We know you're busy with your hospital work," my father would say, "but family should come first. Your cousins notice when you're not there, and people talk about your priorities." What my family didn't understand was that I wasn't missing their events by choice. I was saving lives in emergency situations that couldn't be postponed or rescheduled. The night I missed my cousin Fatima's engagement party, I was performing emergency surgery on a car accident victim whose internal bleeding would have been fatal if we had waited until morning. The day I couldn't attend my nephew's first birthday celebration, I was working in the trauma bay, treating victims of a bombing that had killed 12 people and wounded dozens more. Syria's political situation was deteriorating rapidly during my residency years, with peaceful protests giving way to armed conflict and ultimately to the civil war that would devastate our country for the next decade. The hospital where I was training became increasingly busy with trauma cases, as violence in Damascus and surrounding areas brought a steady stream of wounded civilians and combatants to our emergency department. This was where I discovered my true calling. Working under the extreme pressure of mass casualty events, with limited resources and overwhelming numbers of critically injured patients, I developed skills in trauma surgery and emergency medicine that would have taken years to acquire under normal circumstances. My attending physicians began relying on me for the most complex cases, recognizing that I could maintain focus and precision under pressure that would overwhelm other residents. Dr. Khoury, who had become my primary mentor, started including me in surgeries that were normally reserved for senior residents and fellows. "Amara," he told me during my final year of residency, "you're one of the most naturally gifted trauma surgeons I've ever trained. You have an unusual combination of technical skill, emotional resilience, and strategic thinking that makes you ideal for emergency medicine in conflict situations." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are organizations, international humanitarian groups, refugee assistance programs, emergency medical teams, that desperately need surgeons with your abilities. The work is dangerous and demanding, but it's also some of the most important medical service being done anywhere in the world." The opportunity he was describing represented everything I had hoped for when I first chose to pursue medicine: the chance to use my skills in service to others, to work in situations where medical intervention could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of people, to serve God through healing in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. But accepting such a position would also mean leaving Syria, possibly for years, and further alienating myself from a family that already saw my career as evidence of misplaced priorities. That evening, I called my parents to discuss the opportunity. The conversation was even more difficult than I had anticipated. "Amara," my father said, "you're 30 years old, unmarried, and now you want to leave the country to work in refugee camps? Do you understand how this looks to people who care about you? Do you understand what you're giving up?" "Baba, this is exactly the kind of work I've been training for. I can save lives in situations where my skills can make a real difference." "Isn't serving others one of the highest callings in Islam?" "Yes, serving others is important," my mother interjected, "but so is serving your family and raising the next generation. You can serve God through many different paths, but you only have one opportunity to build a family of your own." The conversation ended with the same fundamental disagreement that had defined our relationship for years. They saw my career choices as evidence of selfishness and poor judgment. I saw their expectations as limitations that would prevent me from using my talents in service to others. 3 months later, I accepted a position with Médecins Sans Frontières, beginning what would become a 12-year career working in some of the most dangerous and challenging medical environments in the world. My first assignment was to a refugee camp in Jordan, where hundreds of thousands of Syrians who had fled the civil war were living in conditions that stretched international humanitarian resources beyond their limits. The medical facilities were overwhelmed, understaffed, and dealing with everything from routine childhood illnesses to complex trauma cases that required immediate surgical intervention. Working 18-hour days in temperatures that reached 115 degrees Fahrenheit, with medical supplies that were always in short supply and equipment that broke down regularly, I learned to practice medicine in ways that no medical school had prepared me for. Every day brought impossible decisions about resource allocation, triage protocols, and treatment priorities that would determine who lived and who died. But it was also the most meaningful work I had ever done. In a single week, I might perform emergency surgery on a child who had been injured by an improvised explosive device, deliver a baby whose mother had walked for 3 days to reach medical care, treat elderly refugees suffering from chronic conditions that had gone untreated for months, and coordinate with other medical teams to respond to outbreaks of infectious diseases that could spread rapidly through the crowded camp conditions. The refugees I treated came from all over Syria, bringing stories of violence and loss that illustrated the human cost of the conflict that was tearing our country apart. But they also brought courage, resilience, and determination that inspired me to work harder and longer than I had thought possible. A grandmother who had walked 200 miles with her wounded grandson, carrying him when he was too weak to walk, in order to reach medical care. A father who had donated blood for 3 different patients because his son's life had been saved by the generosity of strangers. A teenage girl who had lost her entire family but still spent her days helping other children in the camp learn to read and write. These people represented the best of what humans could be under the worst possible circumstances, and being able to serve them through medical care felt like the highest honor of my life. But my family's understanding of what I was doing remained limited by their inability to see my work firsthand and by the necessarily vague descriptions I could provide during our infrequent phone conversations. "How are you, Habibti?" my mother would ask during our monthly calls. "I'm well, Mama. Busy with work, but well. Are you taking care of yourself? Are you eating properly? Have you met any nice Syrian men among the other aid workers?" The questions were always the same, focused on my personal welfare and relationship status rather than on the medical work that defined my daily existence. When I would try to share details about particularly challenging cases or successful outcomes, the conversations would quickly return to concerns about my health, my safety, and my prospects for marriage. My father's questions were slightly more focused on my professional development, but they revealed the same fundamental misunderstanding of what I was actually doing. Are you learning new surgical techniques? Are you building relationships with other doctors who might help you find a position back in Damascus eventually? The assumption was always that my work with humanitarian organizations was temporary, a phase that would eventually give way to a more conventional medical career in Syria, ideally combined with marriage and family responsibilities. They had no understanding of the scope and complexity of the work I was doing, the lives I was saving, or the professional recognition I was earning within the international humanitarian community. During my second year with MSF, I was promoted to chief surgeon for a field hospital in Lebanon that served both Syrian refugees and Lebanese communities affected by spillover violence from the civil war. The position required managing a medical team of 45 people, coordinating with UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations, and making strategic decisions about medical priorities under constantly changing security conditions. The promotion came with recognition from MSF's leadership that I had demonstrated exceptional skill in trauma surgery and unusual aptitude for managing medical operations under extreme pressure. It also came with responsibilities that would have challenged physicians with decades more experience than I had. But when I called home to share the news, the response was predictably focused on different concerns. "Chief surgeon sounds very impressive, Amara," my father said, "but what does that mean for your long-term plans? You can't work in refugee camps forever. When are you planning to return to Syria and establish a proper medical practice? Baba, this is a proper medical practice. I'm responsible for medical care for 30,000 people. I perform more complex surgeries in a month than most surgeons perform in a year. I understand that the work is challenging, but it's not building toward anything permanent. You're not establishing relationships with colleagues who could help you build a practice. You're not meeting potential husbands. You're not saving money for your future. What happens when you're 40 and you want to start a family? The questions were familiar, but they stung more than usual because I was beginning to ask some of them myself. At 32, with 12 years of medical training and practice behind me, I was achieving professional success that exceeded my wildest dreams, but I was also increasingly isolated from the family and cultural connections that had shaped my identity. I was fluent in 4 languages, had performed surgery in 6 different countries, and was consulted by international health organizations about emergency medical protocols. But I was also alone in ways that were becoming more difficult to ignore as I watched colleagues find partners who shared their commitment to humanitarian work. The breakthrough in my relationship with my family came unexpectedly during my 3rd year as chief surgeon, when a delegation from the Syrian Ministry of Health visited our field hospital as part of a coordination meeting with international humanitarian organizations. The delegation included Dr. Samir Khalil, who had been a colleague of my father's decades earlier and who recognized my name from old conversations about his brilliant daughter who had chosen an unconventional path. "Are you Omar Hassan's daughter?" he asked when he was introduced to me as the chief surgeon. "Yes, sir. Your father spoke about you often when we worked together years ago. He was very proud of your intelligence but worried about your career choices. I think he would be amazed to see what you've accomplished." Dr. Khalil spent the day observing our medical operations, watching me perform surgery, coordinate with staff, and manage the complex logistics of providing medical care under resource constraints. At the end of his visit, he asked if he could call my father to share his observations. "Dr. Hassan," he said when my father came to the phone, "I wanted you to know that I've just spent the day with your daughter Amara, and I think you should be extraordinarily proud of what she has accomplished." The conversation that followed was the first time anyone had described my work to my parents in terms they could understand and appreciate. Dr. Khalil explained that I was running one of the most successful field hospitals in the region, that my surgical skills were recognized throughout the international humanitarian community, and that the work I was doing was saving hundreds of lives. "Omar," he concluded, "your daughter has become one of the most respected surgeons working in emergency medicine anywhere in the Middle East. She's brought honor to your family name through service that represents the highest ideals of both medicine and Islam." That evening, I received a phone call from my parents that was unlike any conversation we had shared in years. "Amara," my father said, his voice thick with emotion, "Dr. Khalil told us about your work, about what you've accomplished, about the respect you've earned. We had no idea. We're so sorry that we didn't understand." "Habibti," my mother added, "we thought you were working in refugee camps because you couldn't find proper employment. We didn't realize that you were choosing to work there because you were one of the few people qualified to do such important work." The conversation continued for over an hour, with my parents asking detailed questions about my responsibilities, my achievements, and my future plans. For the first time in years, they were genuinely interested in my professional life rather than focused only on my personal circumstances. But the real transformation in our relationship was still ahead, triggered by an event that would bring my 2 worlds together in ways I never could have anticipated. My cousin Layla, daughter of my father's brother, was getting married to a prominent businessman in Damascus. The wedding was planned as a major family celebration, with hundreds of guests representing the social and professional networks that defined our extended family's status in Syrian society. I had initially planned to decline the invitation, as I had declined most family celebrations over the past decade. The demands of my work made it difficult to travel to Syria for social events, and the awkwardness of family interactions had made these gatherings more stressful than enjoyable. But my parents had specifically requested that I attend, explaining that my absence from yet another major family event was beginning to affect their relationships with extended family members. "Amara," my mother said during one of our phone conversations, "people are starting to say that we've lost you entirely, that you've abandoned your family for work that takes you away from everything that should matter to you. Just this once, can you come home and show people that you're still part of this family?" I arranged for a temporary replacement and flew to Damascus for the wedding, arriving 2 days before the ceremony to spend time with family members I hadn't seen in years. The reunion was as awkward as I had expected. Extended family members greeted me with polite interest but obvious uncertainty about how to relate to someone whose life had diverged so dramatically from conventional expectations. Conversations were stilted, focused on safe topics like health and travel rather than on the work that defined my daily existence. The wedding reception was held at the Four Seasons Hotel in Damascus, with elaborate decorations, traditional music, and hundreds of guests celebrating Layla's marriage in a style that reflected our family's social status and cultural values. I wore a conservative blue dress that would be appropriate for the formal occasion while avoiding the kind of attention that might make other guests uncomfortable. I had planned to attend the ceremony, congratulate the couple, and leave early to avoid extended social interactions that would inevitably lead to uncomfortable conversations about my unmarried status and unconventional career. But during the reception, as I stood near the back of the ballroom trying to remain inconspicuous, a man I didn't recognize approached me with obvious purpose. "Excuse me," he said in English, "are you Dr. Amara Hassan?" The question was asked loudly enough that several nearby conversations stopped. Family members who had been politely ignoring me suddenly turned to listen. "Yes," I replied simply. "I'm James Morrison, humanitarian coordinator for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees," he said, extending his hand. "I was hoping I might have the chance to meet you. Your reputation in the humanitarian medical community is extraordinary." The room around us had grown noticeably quieter, with more family members turning to observe our conversation. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, confused about how this UN official had recognized me and why he was seeking me out at a family wedding. "Dr. Hassan," he continued, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly attentive crowd, "you're Dr. Amara Hassan, chief surgeon for the MSF Field Hospital in the Bekaa Valley, correct? The surgeon who performed the miraculous series of operations during the Zaatari camp medical crisis last year?" I nodded, still uncertain about where this conversation was leading. "Dr. Hassan," he said, turning slightly so that his words would carry to the crowd that was now openly listening, "your work has saved thousands of lives. The surgical protocols you developed for mass casualty events are being implemented in refugee camps across 3 continents. You're literally one of the most important emergency surgeons working anywhere in the world today." The silence that followed was absolute. Every conversation in our section of the ballroom had stopped. Family members were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something that might have been awe. Mr. Morrison continued, unaware of the family dynamics he was exposing. "I was hoping to discuss the possibility of your joining a UN medical mission to establish surgical capabilities in refugee camps in East Africa. We're looking for someone with your experience and expertise to lead medical operations for some of the most challenging humanitarian situations currently facing the international community." My uncle Mahmoud, Layla's father and the host of the wedding, stepped forward with obvious confusion. "I'm sorry, but I think there may be some mistake. This is my niece Amara. She works in medical analysis. She's not a surgeon." Mr. Morrison looked at Uncle Mahmoud with genuine surprise, then back at me. "Sir, with respect, Dr. Hassan is one of the most accomplished trauma surgeons in the Middle East. She's chief of surgery for a field hospital that serves 30,000 refugees. She's performed over 2,000 complex surgical procedures in the past 3 years alone, many under conditions that would challenge the most experienced surgeons in the world." He pulled out his phone and showed my uncle a photo that had been taken without my knowledge of me in surgical scrubs, emerging from an operating tent after a particularly difficult day that had required 17 hours of continuous surgery. This photo was taken after Dr. Hassan performed emergency surgery on 37 children who were injured in a bombing attack on a refugee camp. She worked for 28 hours straight, saving every single child who could be saved. The UN is considering her for the highest humanitarian service awards. The crowd around us had grown as other guests moved closer to listen to this unexpected conversation. I could see my parents pushing through the group, their faces reflecting the same confusion and shock that I saw in other family members. "Amara," my father said when he reached us, "what is this man talking about?" Before I could answer, Mr. Morrison continued his explanation, apparently believing that he was simply clarifying a misunderstanding rather than revealing information that would transform family relationships. Dr. Hassan has spent the past 12 years working in the most dangerous and challenging medical environments in the world. She served in refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq. She's developed surgical techniques that are now standard protocols for emergency medicine in conflict zones. Medical schools are using her case studies to train the next generation of humanitarian surgeons. He paused, looking around at the stunned faces surrounding us. "I assume you all know this already, but just to be clear, your daughter, your niece, your cousin is one of the most respected medical professionals working in international humanitarian aid today. We consider her one of the heroes of contemporary emergency medicine." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for minutes. I could hear music and conversation from other parts of the ballroom, but our section had become completely quiet as family members tried to process information that challenged everything they thought they knew about me. Finally, my grandmother, the family matriarch whose opinion carried more weight than anyone else's, stepped forward. At 87, she moved slowly but with the dignity that commanded respect from everyone in our extended family. "Amara," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite her age, "is what this man says true? Have you been saving lives in refugee camps while we thought you were wasting your life?" "Yes, Tata," I replied, using the Arabic term for grandmother that I had used since childhood. "It's true." She studied my face for a long moment, then turned to address the crowd of family members who were still staring at me with varying expressions of shock and confusion. "Then we have been fools," she said simply. While we were worrying about Amara's future, she was securing the future of thousands of other people. While we were concerned that she wasn't serving her family, she was serving God through healing. While we thought she had lost her way, she was finding a path that brought honor to our family name in ways we were too blind to see. She turned back to me, and for the first time in 12 years, I saw pride in her eyes when she looked at me. "Ya Habibti," she said, "forgive us for not understanding. You have brought more honor to this family than any of us imagined possible." The transformation in family dynamics was immediate and profound. Extended family members who had been treating me with polite distance suddenly wanted to hear detailed stories about my work. Cousins who had viewed me as a cautionary tale began asking questions about my experiences and expressing admiration for my achievements. Uncle Mahmoud, still processing the revelation, approached me with obvious emotion. "Amara, I owe you an enormous apology. We've spent years pitying you, thinking you had chosen loneliness over family. We had no idea that you were choosing service over comfort, that you were sacrificing personal happiness to save the lives of strangers. Uncle, you didn't have the information you needed to understand. I couldn't share the details of my work, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap between what I was doing and what you thought I was doing. But we should have trusted you. We should have recognized that someone with your intelligence and your values wouldn't waste her life on meaningless work. We should have known that if you were choosing a difficult path, there must be important reasons." The conversation with Mr. Morrison continued for another hour, with him describing opportunities for advancing international humanitarian medicine that would challenge even my accumulated experience and expertise. But more importantly, it was a conversation that my family could finally understand and appreciate. They heard him describe medical challenges that required the highest levels of skill and dedication. They heard him explain the strategic importance of humanitarian medicine in addressing global conflicts and refugee crises. They heard him speak about my work in terms that aligned with their deepest values about service, sacrifice, and using one's talents for the greater good. As the evening progressed, the wedding celebration continued around us, but our family section had become an impromptu forum for discussing international humanitarian work, emergency medicine, and the role of Syrian medical professionals in addressing the refugee crisis that had displaced millions of our countrymen. My brother Khalil, who had always been polite but distant when discussing my career, approached me with genuine curiosity for the first time in years. "Amara, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll forgive me for being so ignorant about your work. When you perform surgery in a refugee camp, what kind of conditions are you working under? Do you have the same equipment and resources that you would have in a regular hospital?" The question opened a conversation about the realities of practicing medicine under extreme resource constraints, the innovative solutions required when standard equipment isn't available, and the emotional challenges of making life-or-death decisions when you can't save everyone who needs help. As I described some of the cases I had worked on, performing surgery by flashlight during power outages, creating improvised medical devices when standard equipment failed, coordinating with other aid organizations to treat mass casualties from bombings and natural disasters, I watched my family's understanding of my work transform from confusion to respect to something approaching awe. My mother, who had spent 12 years worrying that I was wasting my intelligence and my potential, listened with tears in her eyes as I described treating children who had been injured by the same violence that had forced their families to flee Syria. "Amara," she said quietly, "when I worried about you not having children of your own, I didn't realize that you were saving the children of hundreds of other mothers. When I was concerned that you weren't serving your family, I didn't understand that you were serving the entire human family." The most meaningful conversation came with my father, who had struggled more than anyone else to understand why I would choose such an unconventional and challenging path. "Habibti," he said when we found a quieter corner of the reception hall, "I owe you an apology that's 12 years overdue. I've spent your entire adult life thinking that you were rejecting the values I tried to teach you: service, dedication, using your talents to help others. I didn't realize that you were embracing those values more completely than I ever imagined possible. Baba, you taught me everything that made my work possible. You showed me what it meant to dedicate your life to healing. You demonstrated that medicine is a form of worship, a way of serving God through serving others. I just applied those lessons in a different context than you had expected. But I didn't support you when you needed support. I questioned your judgment when I should have trusted your calling. I worried about your social status when I should have been proud of your service." We talked for over an hour about the intersection of medicine and faith, about the responsibility that comes with having healing skills in a world full of suffering, and about the different ways that service can manifest depending on circumstances and opportunities. For the first time since I had chosen to pursue medicine, I felt completely understood and supported by my father, not despite my unconventional choices, but because of the values that had motivated those choices. The evening concluded with my grandmother asking me to address the entire wedding reception about my work. Standing before hundreds of guests who represented the social and cultural network that had defined my family's identity for generations, I spoke for the first time about the intersection of medical service and spiritual calling that had shaped my career. My family taught me that the highest calling in life is to serve others, to use whatever talents God has given you to ease suffering and bring healing to a broken world, I began. For 12 years, I've had the privilege of serving Syrian refugees and other displaced people through emergency medicine, trying to apply the values my family taught me in circumstances that required leaving behind many of the expectations that had defined their understanding of service. I described some of the cases that had shaped my understanding of medicine as a form of worship, treating victims of violence with the same care I would give to my own family members, working with medical teams from different faith traditions united by their commitment to healing, finding hope and resilience in the most desperate circumstances imaginable. "I'm not telling you this to seek recognition or praise," I continued, "but to illustrate that the values we cherish as Syrians, as Muslims, as human beings can be expressed through many different paths. Service doesn't always look the way we expect it to look, but it always requires sacrifice, dedication, and the willingness to put others' needs ahead of our own comfort. The response was unlike anything I had experienced at a family gathering. Instead of polite applause and quick transitions to other topics, there were detailed questions about humanitarian work, expressions of pride in my achievements, and obvious respect for the path I had chosen. More importantly, there were apologies, from extended family members who recognized that they had misjudged my choices, from cousins who admitted they had used my example as a cautionary tale about the dangers of too much education, from aunts and uncles who acknowledged that they had failed to see the honor in work that didn't fit conventional categories. The weeks that followed Layla's wedding brought a fundamental transformation in my family relationships. My parents began sharing news of my work with their social circles, describing my achievements with the same pride they had always shown for my brother's more conventional successes. Extended family members who had whispered about the lost daughter began referring to me as the doctor who saves lives in refugee camps, with obvious pride in having such a person connected to their family. Most importantly, the younger generation of female cousins began asking questions about pursuing careers in medicine, about the possibilities for combining professional achievement with service to others, and about the different ways that success could be defined and achieved. 6 months after the wedding, I received an offer that represented the culmination of everything I had worked toward in my medical career. The World Health Organization was establishing a new program to train emergency medical teams for rapid deployment to disaster zones and conflict areas around the world. They wanted me to serve as the program's director, overseeing the development of training protocols, managing international coordination, and leading the medical response to major humanitarian crises. The position would be based in Geneva, with frequent travel to crisis zones around the world. It represented recognition at the highest levels of international humanitarian work, with responsibilities that would shape emergency medical response globally for decades to come. But it would also mean leaving the Middle East, possibly permanently, and taking on administrative responsibilities that would reduce my direct patient care work. For the first time in my career, I called my parents to ask for their advice about a professional decision. "Amara," my father said after I had described the opportunity, "this sounds like the kind of position that could allow you to save even more lives by training other doctors to do the work you've been doing. It sounds like a natural progression for someone with your experience and expertise. But it would mean leaving the region, possibly for many years. It would mean seeing you even less frequently than I do now." "Habibti," my mother interjected, "we've learned that your service to others is more important than our desire to have you nearby. If this position allows you to multiply your impact by training other doctors, then you should take it with our blessing and our pride." The conversation continued for over an hour, with my parents asking thoughtful questions about the scope of the position, the challenges it would present, and the opportunities it would create for advancing international humanitarian medicine. When I finally accepted the WHO position, the announcement was covered by medical journals and humanitarian publications around the world. For the first time, my professional achievements were documented in ways that my family could read and share with others. The article in the Middle East Medical Journal described my career trajectory from Damascus medical student to international humanitarian leader, with detailed discussion of the surgical innovations I had developed and the training programs I had created. My mother called me after reading the article, her voice filled with emotion. "Amara, reading about your work in a medical journal, seeing your achievements described by other doctors who respect what you've accomplished, I finally understand what we were too blind to see for so many years. Mama, you understand now. That's what matters." "No, Habibti, what matters is that you never let our failure to understand stop you from pursuing the path God had laid out for you. You honored your calling even when it cost you our support. That takes a kind of courage I'm not sure I would have had." The move to Geneva brought new challenges and opportunities that tested everything I had learned about medicine, leadership, and international coordination. Managing training programs for medical teams from dozens of countries, each with their own protocols and cultural approaches to emergency medicine, required diplomatic skills I had never needed as a field surgeon. But it also brought the satisfaction of seeing the techniques and protocols I had developed during my years in refugee camps being taught to new generations of humanitarian medical workers. The surgical procedures I had improvised out of necessity were becoming standard training for emergency medicine worldwide. More importantly, it brought recognition from my family that was deeper and more meaningful than anything I had experienced during my medical career. My brother Samir visited me in Geneva during my first year with WHO, spending a week observing my work and meeting colleagues from around the world who spoke about my contributions to humanitarian medicine with obvious respect and admiration. "Amara," he said on his last evening there, "I need to tell you something that I should have said years ago. When we were growing up, I always thought I was the successful brother and you were the sister who couldn't figure out how to fit into the family expectations. I was wrong about everything. Samir, we both found ways to serve that matched our abilities and circumstances." "No, we didn't. I found a way to make money and gain social status by working in our uncle's business. You found a way to save lives and serve humanity by using your medical skills in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. There's no comparison between what you've accomplished and what I've accomplished." The conversation continued late into the evening, with my brother expressing genuine admiration for the path I had chosen and obvious regret for the years he had spent not understanding or supporting my choices. 2 years into my WHO position, I was selected to receive the Albert Schweitzer Prize for Humanitarian Medicine, an award that recognizes exceptional contribution to emergency medical care in conflict and disaster zones. The ceremony was held in Geneva, with representatives from medical organizations around the world attending to honor the year's recipients. My entire family made the trip to Geneva for the ceremony: parents, brothers, sisters-in-law, and a delegation of extended family members who wanted to witness this recognition of achievements they now understood and celebrated. The citation read during the awards ceremony described my work in terms that captured everything I had hoped to accomplish through medical service. Dr. Amara Hassan has dedicated her career to providing emergency medical care in some of the most dangerous and challenging environments in the world. Her innovations in trauma surgery under resource constraints have saved thousands of lives and established new standards for humanitarian medicine. Her leadership in training the next generation of emergency medical workers will multiply her impact for decades to come. As I stood at the podium accepting the award, looking out at an audience that included the family members who had spent years not understanding my choices, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond professional recognition. The young woman who had chosen medical school over marriage proposals, who had pursued surgery despite family disapproval, who had spent 12 years working in refugee camps while her family worried about her wasted potential, had become exactly who she was meant to be. But more importantly, her family had learned to see that service can take many forms, that honor can be achieved through unconventional paths, and that the greatest achievements are often invisible to those who don't know how to look for them. In my acceptance speech, I spoke about the intersection of medical service and spiritual calling, about the responsibility that comes with having healing skills in a world full of suffering, and about the importance of family support for those who choose difficult paths of service. The work I've had the privilege of doing, I concluded, would not have been possible without the foundation of values that my family provided: dedication to serving others, commitment to using one's talents for the greater good, and the understanding that the highest calling in life is to ease suffering and bring healing to a broken world. After the ceremony, at the reception held in the WHO headquarters, my grandmother approached me with obvious emotion. At 93, she had insisted on making the difficult journey to Geneva because, she said, she needed to witness this recognition of achievements she had finally learned to understand and appreciate. "Ya Habibti," she said, taking my hands in hers, "I want to ask your forgiveness for all the years we failed to see what you were accomplishing. We measured your success by the wrong standards, and we almost missed recognizing that you had become exactly what every parent hopes their child will become: someone who uses their gifts to serve others, regardless of personal cost. Tata, you see clearly now. That's what matters. No, what matters is that you never stopped serving, even when we didn't understand. What matters is that you followed your calling despite our failure to support you. What matters is that you became a healer of the highest order while we were worried about social conventions. The conversation continued as other family members joined us, each expressing pride in my achievements and gratitude for the lessons my journey had taught them about service, sacrifice, and the many different ways that honor can be earned. 3 years later, when my niece Layla, my brother Khalil's daughter, announced that she wanted to pursue medicine with a focus on international humanitarian work, the family response was completely different from what I had experienced 20 years earlier. Instead of concerns about marriage prospects and social expectations, there were thoughtful questions about the best medical schools for humanitarian medicine, practical discussions about language skills and cultural preparation for international work, and obvious pride in having another family member choosing to serve others through medical practice. Aunt Amara, Layla said when she asked for my advice about her career plans, "I want to do the kind of work you do. I want to be a doctor who saves lives in places where medical help is most needed." "Then you should pursue that calling with everything you have," I replied. "And you should know that you'll have the support of a family that understands the value of service, even when it requires unconventional choices." As I look back on the journey that brought me from Damascus medical student to international humanitarian leader, I'm struck by how different the story might have been if my family had understood from the beginning what I was trying to accomplish through medical service. But I'm also grateful for the lesson that their initial lack of understanding taught me, that the most important validation comes from within, from the knowledge that you're using your talents in service to others, regardless of whether that service is recognized or appreciated by those closest to you. The work I've had the privilege of doing, saving lives in refugee camps, training the next generation of humanitarian medical workers, developing protocols that will be used in emergency situations for decades to come, has been its own reward, independent of family approval or social recognition. But having that approval and recognition now, after years of working without it, feels like a gift that makes all the difficult moments worthwhile. Today, when young women in my family ask about pursuing careers that might challenge traditional expectations, they're encouraged to follow their callings with confidence that their families will support them, even if the path isn't immediately understood. They know that service can take many forms, that achievement doesn't always fit conventional categories, and that the greatest honor comes from using whatever talents God has given you to ease suffering and bring healing to a broken world. They know that sometimes the people who judge us harshest are the ones who understand us least, but that doesn't make our calling any less valid or our service any less valuable. Most importantly, they know that your purpose doesn't need anyone's permission, not even your family's, and that the work of healing and service is always worth pursuing, regardless of whether others can see its value. If my story resonates with you today, if you've ever been misunderstood by your own family or had your calling dismissed by those whose opinions matter most to you, I want you to know that your worth isn't determined by their understanding. The work you're called to do, the service you can provide, the difference you can make, these have value regardless of who recognizes them. Drop a comment below sharing your own experiences with family expectations and following unconventional paths. Have you ever had to choose between your calling and your family's approval? How did you find the strength to keep going when others didn't understand your choices? And if you know someone who needs to hear this message about following their purpose despite opposition, please share this story with them. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own definition of success, about the courage it takes to serve without recognition, and about the healing that comes when families learn to see beyond their own expectations. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, sometimes the greatest honor comes from the paths others call disgraceful, but that doesn't make them any less worthy of pursuit.